Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Just smile and say congratulations, Dana. That's what Dad whispered to me as we stepped into the steakhouse lobby, all mahogany walls and low lighting like it was trying to hush us before we even spoke. His hand grazed the small of my back like it used to when I was a kid, and he was trying to guide me out of trouble without making a scene. "Don't bring up the lawsuit," he said under his breath, his voice calm and practiced, like he'd rehearsed that line in the car on the way over. "Let him have his moment." I didn't nod. I didn't agree. But I didn't argue either. I just walked beside him in silence, smoothing down the front of my navy blouse that I'd ironed twice this morning, even though I knew damn well no one would notice, because tonight wasn't about me, it was about Ethan. Ethan, who had always been the star. Ethan, who could screw up and still land on his feet because someone, somewhere, would always throw him a rope and say, "We know your heart, buddy." And I was the one always left holding the rope burns. The restaurant was packed, the air thick with money and butter, and that smug undertone that successful men give off when they're surrounded by people pretending they're not intimidated. A long table waited near the back, set for 15, with thick white napkins folded like origami and glasses already sweating from the chilled water someone had poured in anticipation. Ethan stood near the head of the table in a tailored charcoal suit, laughing like he'd just remembered the punchline of the best joke in the world. His arm rested lightly on the shoulder of his wife, Claire, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, her smile sharp, her posture tight, and her eyes starting to the door like she expected something to come crashing through it. When he saw me, his eyes lit up not with warmth, but with the surprise you offer to a guest who wasn't technically invited, but showed up anyway. "Dana," he said, and I swear I heard the word come out shaped like a question. "You made it." "I did," I replied, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear even though I hadn't worn it down. "It's not every day my big brother gets promoted to Vice President of Strategic Operations. Or whatever overly complicated title they gave you." He chuckled and gave me a quick hug, all surface-level affection, the kind you give to distant relatives at funerals. Then he moved on, greeting more guests, shaking hands, toasting with glasses of red wine that matched the slight flush creeping up his neck. He looked good. He always did, clean-cut, confident, just enough of a tan to suggest he had time for golf, but not enough to imply he wasn't working hard. A born politician trapped in a corporate ladder climb, and damn if he didn't know exactly how to step over people without leaving a footprint. Dinner started slow, the way all these things do, with polite conversation and small talk that skimmed the surface of everyone's lives like skipping stones. I listened to stories I'd heard before, nodded at names I didn't recognize, and sipped my iced tea like it was whiskey, just to give myself something to do with my hands. Ethan gave a little speech after the entrees were served, a well-rehearsed performance about team effort, resilience, and gratitude, all the while carefully skirting any mention of the thing that had gotten him there. The thing no one talked about. The thing I wasn't supposed to mention. See, what most people at that table didn't know, or pretended not to know, was that just 7 months ago, I worked at the same company. Not just in the same company, but in the same department. Ethan was my direct manager's manager. And when I filed a formal complaint about that manager, about the inappropriate comments, the late-night texts, the hand that lingered too long on my back during one of those team-building retreats, things didn't just get quiet. They got hostile. Suddenly I was labeled difficult. Meetings got moved without me. Projects I'd been leading were reassigned. My yearly review, once glowing, came back with phrases like disruptive energy and struggles to collaborate. Ethan said nothing. I asked him, point blank, in a conference room with the door half cracked open so no one would accuse me of cornering him, why he wasn't backing me up. He just sighed, pinched the bridge of his nose like I'd given him a headache, and said, "It's complicated, Dana. You need to think about the bigger picture." The bigger picture, apparently, meant keeping me quiet long enough for the company to offer me a severance package disguised as a favor and shove me out the back door before I could cause real damage. The lawsuit came later, after I realized just how many women had gone through the same thing. One of them even had screenshots, another had a voice memo. And even then, the settlement talks started fast, like they'd been prepared for this. Like someone had seen it coming and laid down the tarp to cover the blood before the first blow even landed. But I said nothing. Not at the dinner. Not when Ethan's mentor toasted his unshakable integrity. Not even when my mother leaned over and whispered, "See, this is how good things happen when you just move on." I just kept chewing my salmon and smiling when the camera came out for pictures. Until Richard Bennett walked in. Now, I hadn't seen Richard since the day I was escorted out of the building with a cardboard box and an apologetic nod from the intern whose name I never learned. He was the VP of Operations, the one who claimed he didn't have enough details to comment when HR sent out a memo about my departure. He walked in that night wearing a gray blazer and that same unreadable face, like a man who lived off ambiguity. Everyone turned to him, expecting a speech, maybe a joke. But he just looked around the table, then locked eyes with me, not Ethan, not the guest of honor, but me, and said, "I'm here because HR asked me to be." And, just like that, the room went dead silent. Claire stopped chewing. My father's hand froze halfway to his glass. Ethan blinked, his mouth twitching like it was trying to find a smile and couldn't. And I sat very still, not smiling anymore, just breathing slow and steady like someone who knows the grenade's already been tossed and is waiting to see who it hits first. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be sitting in a steakhouse surrounded by half-drunk executives and distant cousins who only called when they needed something, silently calculating how many ways a family can twist itself into silence, I probably would have laughed, maybe even rolled my eyes, because back then I still believed in some raw, desperate way that truth had a weight of its own, that if you held on to it long enough, it would eventually press its way to the surface like a splinter, working itself out of skin. But that was before I learned that people will go to astonishing lengths not to hear what makes them uncomfortable, and sometimes, especially in families like mine, where image is currency and silence is a second language, the truth doesn't just die. It gets buried alive, with your name carved on the tombstone as the one who put it there. 6 months before that dinner, I was still clocking in every morning at Argonne Logistics, carrying my travel mug full of bitter gas station coffee, pushing through spreadsheets that didn't add up and meetings that always started late and ended without decisions. I wasn't happy, but I was surviving, and when you've grown up as the second child of George and Linda Carlisle, a man who believed feelings were a private indulgence and a woman who could pivot a conversation away from conflict with the grace of a seasoned politician, survival felt like a pretty solid win. I kept my head down. I finished my work early. I stayed out of office gossip, even when it circled around me like sharks smelling blood. Then came Martin. Martin Keller, regional manager, charismatic in the way that only mediocre men can be when the system's always bent slightly in their favor. He wore loafers with no socks, drove a leased Tesla he couldn't afford, and talked about his grind set like he was auditioning for a TED Talk. And he loved to linger. Not just in conversation, though he did that too, standing too close in the break room, laughing too long at jokes I never told, but physically, hovering behind me at my desk, brushing past me in narrow hallways with that practiced casualness that made it seem like I was imagining the tension. It started with compliments. "That color looks great on you, Dana," or "You've got such a calming presence, the guys in logistics could learn from you." Then came the comments about my personal life, the invitations to grab drinks after hours just to talk, and the late-night messages about urgent deadlines that somehow always drifted into personal territory by message. 4. I ignored it for weeks. Told myself I was overreacting. Told myself this is just what happens when you're a woman in a male-dominated department, that if I made a fuss, it would follow me. Ethan never said anything directly, but there was a tone he used whenever I brought up challenges at work, a patronizing, slow exhale, like I was a child trying to describe a monster under my bed. "It's not that simple, Dana," he'd say. "You can't just accuse people. You don't want to damage your credibility over something that might be misinterpreted." And I let that tone sink into me, made it part of my thinking, until the night Martin messaged me a photo of himself shirtless at a hotel gym with the caption, "Late night hustle. You in?" I didn't report him that night. I sat on the floor of my apartment with the lights off, staring at my phone until the screen dimmed and the silence around me turned heavy. The next morning, I showed the photo to HR. I printed it out. I brought messages. I filed an official complaint. They nodded. They said the right things. They thanked me for my courage. And then, just like that, everything changed. Martin wasn't fired. Wasn't even suspended. In fact, a week later, he was on a company retreat in Palm Springs, giving a presentation on culture reform. Meanwhile, I got called into a meeting with 2 HR reps and Ethan, who sat at the end of the table pretending like he wasn't shrinking into a suit. We take these things seriously, they said, but then they asked about my tone in meetings, whether I felt like I fit the team, and how I handled stress. There were suggestions that perhaps my reaction to Martin's messages was disproportionate. That maybe I had misunderstood his intent. Ethan said very little. When I looked to him, searching for some sign of recognition, not even support, just acknowledgement, he kept his eyes on the conference table and picked at the corner of a legal pad like a bored student waiting for class to end. 2 weeks later, I was offered a transition opportunity, which is corporate speak for please go quietly, and we'll make it worth your while. A small severance. A neutral letter. A request to sign a non-disparagement agreement. And a whisper from my mother when I called her crying that evening, please don't make this bigger than it needs to be. Ethan's up for a big promotion. I didn't sign it. I filed a formal lawsuit. I knew it wouldn't win, not in the legal sense. But I needed it to exist. I needed the record to show I hadn't made it up. That someone had listened. That I had tried. Then one night, about 3 weeks after the papers were filed, I got an anonymous email from a burner account. No subject line. No message body. Just attachments, screenshots of internal emails between Martin and another manager. Jokes about my meltdowns. Mentions of my history of emotional instability, a phrase I'd never heard applied to me before, but one that popped up like a weed in an overgrown garden. And at the bottom of the thread, a brief response from Ethan Carlisle. Let's avoid escalation. I'll talk to her. There it was. No defense. No objection. Just a quiet, backroom nod to keep the machine running. He knew. He had known the whole time. And he chose to protect the system, not his sister. I never replied to the burner email. I just stared at it for an hour, then filed it away, unsure what I'd do with it, but certain I wasn't ready to let it go. So when Dad leaned over at the restaurant and said, "Don't bring up the lawsuit, let him have his moment," I didn't respond. I just stared down at the wine glass in front of me, watching the slow drip of condensation run down the side like a clock counting backward. Because I knew something Ethan didn't. I wasn't here to burn bridges. I was here to light the match and see who finally noticed the smoke. By the time the entrees had arrived, juicy slabs of medium-rare filet, buttery mashed potatoes sculpted into swirls, and a line of green beans so precisely arranged they might have been measured with a ruler. The tension at the table had been smoothed over like spackle on cracked drywall, not gone, just hidden beneath a fresh layer of civility that fooled only the ones who needed to be fooled to make it through dinner without choking on their own shame. Ethan, ever the performer, had reclaimed his footing with the ease of a man well-practiced in the art of recovery, lifting his glass for the 3rd time that night in another toast, this one directed toward teamwork, resilience, and the beautiful unpredictability of corporate life, a joke which drew chuckles from the men around the table and a tight-lipped smile from Claire, who hadn't said more than 3 words since Richard Bennett's entrance had shifted the air in the room like someone had opened a freezer door and left it hanging wide. I watched her, really watched her, her knuckles white around her fork, her wine untouched, her eyes flicking between Ethan and Richard like she was waiting for one of them to drop a cue card. It was then that I saw what I hadn't seen in years of family holidays and awkward birthday dinners, the same weight in her expression that I'd once seen in my own bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning. The kind of tight-lipped endurance that doesn't come from love or loyalty, but from obligation, from the fear of what will unravel if you let one single thread go loose. And while Ethan told his polished version of the company's turnaround story, how they'd weathered a rough year, how new leadership had breathed life into tired strategies, how they were a family, really. I felt something small and dark begin to twitch in the pit of my stomach, like a dormant thing waking up to the sound of its own name. Because the thing about liars, and I mean the smooth ones, the ones who lie with warmth and sparkle and sincerity, is that they don't trip up by telling the wrong story. No, they trip up when they tell the story too perfectly, when they forget that truth is messy and uncomfortable and inconvenient, and if it doesn't sting just a little, then it probably isn't honest at all. And Ethan's story? It was spotless. Too spotless. So when he ended his little monologue with that now familiar mantra, "We work like a family here, we protect each other," I laughed. Not loudly, not enough to interrupt, but enough that he noticed, enough that Claire noticed, and enough that Richard Bennett, sitting 2 seats down, turned his head just slightly, not to ask, not to confront, but to signal, "I heard that." Ethan looked at me, eyebrows raised with that cautious half-grin he used to flash when we were kids, and he knew he was about to get caught, but hadn't decided yet whether to deny it or double down. "Something funny, Dana?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes narrowing just enough to betray the discomfort he was trying to mask. I set down my fork, folded my napkin carefully in my lap, and leaned forward just slightly, not enough to seem confrontational, but enough to remind the table I hadn't forgotten how to speak. "I just think it's interesting," I said, my voice even, controlled, the way I'd practiced in the mirror back when I thought I'd have to testify, that a company that works like a family would settle a harassment lawsuit instead of actually addressing the problem. The silence that followed was not theatrical or dramatic. It was the kind of silence that falls over a room like dust in an attic, thick and undisturbed and absolutely suffocating. Claire froze. My mother, across the table, blinked 3 times in quick succession, her silent code for shut it down now, and Dad's jaw tensed so hard I thought I heard a molar crack. Ethan didn't move at first. He just stared at me, like he was waiting for the rest of the punchline, for me to laugh and say kidding, for someone else to take the bullet and let him walk away clean. But no one said anything. Not Richard. Not my aunt who had driven all the way from Richmond. Not even the cousin who worked in HR and had, just an hour earlier, been loudly explaining how the new workplace culture was all about transparency. Nobody. Just me and the echo of my own voice. Ethan cleared his throat. "That's not really appropriate for tonight," he said quietly, his smile tight and fraying at the edges. "We're here to celebrate." "And I am celebrating," I replied, still calm, still deliberate, still holding back the full weight of the fury I hadn't yet unleashed. "I'm celebrating that I'm not afraid of you anymore. Or of what happens when I stop pretending like nothing happened." Claire stood up. Not dramatically. Not even hurriedly. She set her napkin beside her plate and murmured something about needing to use the restroom, but her eyes, those wet, glassy eyes, never met Ethan's as she walked past him without touching his shoulder or even brushing against his jacket. And I saw, in that moment, something crack inside Ethan. Just a flicker. The faintest shimmer of a man realizing that his kingdom was built on sand. Richard Bennett took a sip of his wine and finally spoke. "Well," he said, voice dry as paper, "I suppose that depends on what you think happened, Miss Carlyle." I turned to him steady. "I think you already know," I said. "I think HR knows. I think most of the people at this table know. They've just decided not to care." He stared at me for a moment, that unreadable executive poker face still holding, but I saw something behind it, just the faintest hesitation, the flicker of calculation, the math of risk assessment. And in that split second, I knew what he was really thinking. This is not under control. Ethan was staring at me now with something new in his expression, panic, maybe, or the early stages of rage, the kind that comes when the mask starts to slip and the real face, the unedited one, starts to show. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, I leaned forward and added, in a voice that was quieter, but somehow more dangerous than anything I'd said yet. "You want to talk about family, Ethan? Then let's talk about what it means to protect someone. Because I came to you. I trusted you. And you handed me over to the wolves because it was easier for you. Because it kept your hands clean. But they're not clean, are they? They never were." No one applauded. No one said anything. For a long moment, All anyone could hear was the low hum of the restaurant's overhead vent and the clink of a fork dropped too hard against porcelain at a nearby table. But the tone of the night had changed. Irreversibly. And everyone knew it. This wasn't a dinner anymore. This was a reckoning. And I was only getting started. In the moments that followed my words, there was a strange, electric stillness at the table, an almost physical hush that felt less like silence and more like suspended breath. As though the entire room had collectively braced itself for an aftershock it knew was coming, but couldn't yet measure, and in that suspended air I sat motionless, eyes fixed on Ethan's face, watching the slow unraveling of a man whose charm had always been his armor and whose smile, normally so quick to recover, now hung lifeless and crooked like a portrait knocked askew. No one moved. No one spoke. And it occurred to me, in that flickering second of awareness, that it wasn't just about the words I'd spoken or the lawsuit I'd referenced or even the carefully constructed illusion I had just begun to dismantle. It was about the unspoken agreement we had all signed, silently and over years, a pact built not on love or loyalty, but on complicity, on the quiet belief that certain truths were simply too inconvenient to be acknowledged in polite company. Claire didn't return from the restroom. Whether she'd left the building or was simply hiding in one of the stalls, staring at herself in the mirror and wondering how long she could keep pretending, I didn't know, and truthfully, I didn't care. Because her absence, much like her silence, was just another part of the pattern I had come to know too well, people choosing peace over confrontation, choosing silence over truth, choosing to look away and call it grace. My mother finally broke the stillness, clearing her throat in a strained, high-pitched way that usually meant she was about to change the subject to something aggressively neutral, potato salad recipes, perhaps, or the weather in Asheville. But the effort died in her mouth as she caught sight of Richard Bennett rising slowly from his chair. He didn't speak right away. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, then placed both hands lightly on the back of his chair as if steadying himself for something that would require precise control. The entire table watched him with the anxious deference usually reserved for authority figures at funerals, respectful, wary, and slightly afraid of what would happen if he decided to speak the truth out loud. But instead, he said something entirely unexpected. "I think," Richard began, his voice smooth and unhurried, like a man choosing every syllable with the deliberation of someone negotiating a hostage situation, "we may need to take this conversation offline. Tonight was intended to be a celebration, and I think it's clear we've drifted, considerably." There was no apology in his tone, no softness, no concession to the reality I'd just dragged out into the light. It was a corporate tactic, the verbal equivalent of a smokescreen, an attempt to corral the chaos back into a language of structure and deferral. But it was too late. The spell was broken. And what Richard hadn't accounted for was the fact that I had nothing left to lose, not reputation, not standing, not even family in the traditional sense, because when your own brother lets you drown to keep his hands dry, you stop worrying about keeping the tablecloth clean. "You don't get to move this conversation offline," I said, the words sharp but steady, not shouted, not dramatic, just final. "You brought HR to a dinner party. You thought I wouldn't come. You thought I wouldn't say anything. You thought I'd sit here and let him tell lies about loyalty and family while I smiled and passed the bread rolls." Across the table, one of the junior partners, someone I'd met once before at a holiday mixer, the kind of man who speaks in acronyms and pats women on the back too hard, shifted uncomfortably in his seat and muttered something to the person next to him, who quickly shushed him with a glance. My father sat like a statue, arms crossed, eyes fixed not on me but on his empty plate, his entire posture radiating the sort of resigned disappointment usually reserved for moments when your child brings shame to the family name, not when your son allows harm to unfold on his watch. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a printed packet of emails, not copies, not summaries, but screenshots, complete with metadata and timestamps and internal signatures. I had laminated them, not for protection, but for permanence. For proof. I laid them on the table like a blackjack hand, each page its own accusation, its own bullet, and watched as Richard's face finally faltered. Not much, not dramatically, But just enough, a blink too long, a twitch in the jaw, a small inhale through the nose that betrayed the loss of control he had fought so hard to maintain. "These," I said, "are from someone inside your company who couldn't sleep at night. They didn't send them to a lawyer. They didn't sell them to a tabloid. They sent them to me because they knew I would know what to do with them." Ethan shifted in his chair, his hands now clasped so tightly his knuckles looked bloodless, his face drained of the confident veneer that had carried him through the evening. "Dana, you don't know what you're doing," he said quietly, almost pleading. "You're blowing up something you don't understand." I turned to him slowly, letting the silence expand around us like fog before I spoke. "You think I don't understand? I understand perfectly. I understand what it means to be collateral damage in someone else's climb. I understand how easy it is for you to pretend you're clean because you didn't send the texts, you didn't make the calls, you didn't put your hand on my back, but you knew. You knew and you said nothing. And when I came to you, when I asked you to stand beside me, you offered me silence wrapped in excuses." Angela Harmon, the HR director, who I hadn't even realized was here until she rose quietly from the bar, her face as unreadable as a locked cabinet, walked toward us now, stopping just behind Richard like a shadow with a clipboard. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was confirmation. Damage control had arrived, but the damage was already done. "I'd like to suggest," Angela began, voice clipped and professional, "that we move this into a private space. We don't want this to escalate further in front of." "In front of who?" I snapped, cutting her off with a calmness that startled even me. "These people? These are the people who smiled at me while I was being pushed out the back door. These are the people who clapped for my brother while pretending not to know why I suddenly disappeared. If they're uncomfortable now, maybe they should be." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't lash out. Because what I had now wasn't rage, it was precision. The kind of cold, quiet fire that burns down a house from the inside, slowly and without fanfare. "Richard," I said finally, turning back to him with the weight of the moment squarely between us, "you wanted me invisible. You wanted this moment to belong to Ethan. But you forgot that I used to be one of you. I know how this works. I know who you're protecting. And I know what happens next." The only sound was the soft click of Claire's empty wine glass tipping over in her absence, the red liquid pooling like blood on the white tablecloth as the evening finally surrendered to the truth it had tried so desperately to suppress. And in that silence, I saw Ethan's face collapse, not physically, not in some theatrical way, but inward, like a man realizing the scaffolding he'd built his life on was not steel, but sugar, and the rain had finally come. This wasn't just a reckoning. This was the beginning of a fire no one could put out. And I was done asking for permission to speak. The scent of scorched meat still lingered in the air as if the very walls were absorbing the tension that had, by now, evolved beyond mere discomfort and grown into something sharp, something alive and crawling under the skin of everyone seated at that long, linen-draped table. The red wine, spilled during Claire's quiet exit, had seeped into the folds of the cloth and spread like a stain that refused to be ignored, a visual echo of what had just transpired. What had been said and shown and left inescapably exposed beneath the artificial warmth of those chandelier lights. Nobody reached for the napkins. Nobody moved to clean it. It just sat there, silent and accusatory, a dark bloom of evidence that the evening had derailed in a way no one had anticipated, but everyone now knew was irreversible. Richard Bennett, who just 15 minutes earlier had arrived with the smug composure of a man used to controlling rooms, had stepped back into his role as the tactician, the crisis manager. Though the tightness around his mouth and the flicker of indecision in his eyes betrayed the internal reckoning he was rapidly navigating. Angela from HR, still standing beside him with her clipboard clutched like a weapon, remained expressionless, though her silence spoke of corporate protocol clashing against a far more volatile truth. This wasn't going to be buried with a confidentiality clause and a polished press release. Not tonight. Not in front of witnesses. Not when the person they'd all underestimated had stood up and refused to back down. "I'll be brief," Richard said finally, his tone stripped of all pretense. No longer charming or casual, but pragmatic in the way men sound when the boardroom has become a battlefield and damage mitigation is no longer about denial, but about limiting the blast radius. Dana, I'd like to speak with you privately. There are certain options we may be able to explore. Constructive ones. Options that protect all parties involved. My laughter came low and slow, not theatrical, not loud, but the kind that slips out when something is so absurd, so deeply offensive in its timing, that it bypasses anger and circles straight into disbelief. I stood then, not rushed or aggressive, but deliberate, because I wanted everyone at that table to feel the shift, to register that the dynamic they were used to, the one where I stayed seated, quiet, complicit, had ended. I straightened my blazer. I looked Richard square in the face and I said, "You still think this is about negotiation? You think you can hand me a dollar amount, a severance, a polished excuse, and I'll fold like I did last time? You still think you're running this room?" He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, but because we both knew the answer wasn't his to give anymore. I already sent the emails, I continued, letting the words hang just long enough to watch the reactions ripple across the table. Not to my lawyer. Not to a compliance officer. To a journalist. One who's already confirmed that 3 other former employees told similar stories. And now that Claire's walked out without saying a word to her own husband, I have a feeling she might be ready to talk, too. The murmur began low, a shifting of bodies, the scratch of a chair leg, the exhale of someone finally realizing that this wasn't just messy, it was public. Ethan had gone pale, the kind of pale that drains all color from a man who's just realized the future he's been polishing like a trophy has shattered into glass at his feet. His hands, which had once gestured confidently during his speech, now rested uselessly on the table, fingers curled in on themselves like claws gripping at something already gone. My father, stone-faced and quiet, still hadn't looked at me since the first accusation left my mouth. My mother, red-eyed and motionless, gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles had gone ghost-white, and I could almost hear the words she was struggling not to say, something about grace, about forgiveness, about dignity and discretion. All the things she had confused with silence her entire life. Ethan finally spoke, but it wasn't the speech I expected, not some last-minute redemption plea or desperate attempt to regain control. His voice was small, not broken but brittle, the sound of someone who knows they've lost and is still trying to pretend they haven't. "You think you won, Dana," he said, and though he was trying to sound sharp, it came out tired, hollow. "You think ruining me, ruining all of this, makes you some kind of hero? You didn't change anything. You just made a mess and walked away." I stepped closer, not out of anger, not to intimidate, but because I wanted him to see my face, to hear me without the filter of distance, to know that I wasn't trembling or wavering or looking for permission to say what I was about to say. "I'm not trying to be a hero," I told him, my voice low and deliberate. "I didn't come here to save anyone. I came because I am done being quiet so other people can stay comfortable. I came because you took something from me, and now you're going to live with the truth of what that cost. I didn't come to ruin your celebration, Ethan. I came to reclaim my place in a story you tried to erase me from." He stared at me, his expression flickering between shame and resentment, and for a second, I thought he might get up, might reach for me the way he used to when we were kids and fights ended with shoulder nudges and silent truces. But he didn't move, because there was nothing left to offer. Nothing he could say that wouldn't unravel him even more. I turned to leave, my heels echoing off the polished wood floor, not because I wanted a dramatic exit, but because staying any longer would have made me complicit in the performance all over again. And as I reached the door, the voice that stopped me wasn't Ethan's, wasn't Richard's, wasn't even my father's. It was Angela, the HR director who had remained silent for nearly the entire evening, who had stood there like a statue, waiting for the script to resume. Her voice was soft but resolute. "Dana," she said, and I paused, turning slightly but not facing her fully. "If you walk out now, this will follow all of us." I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her words settle somewhere I no longer carried shame, and said without turning around, "Good." Outside, the night air felt colder than I remembered, sharp and clean, like something that had been locked away too long had finally been let out to breathe. The parking lot was mostly empty now, just a few scattered cars glowing under the harsh yellow streetlights, and I could hear the distant hum of traffic in the background, a reminder that the world kept spinning, even when families fell apart and legacies cracked open. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't call anyone. I simply got in my car and sat there, hands on the wheel, the weight of what I'd done pressing against me, not like a burden, but like gravity, like something real and undeniable and wholly mine. And in that final moment, I wasn't thinking about revenge or justice or whether Ethan would keep his title, whether the company would try to cover this up or spin it or bury it again. I was thinking about that one moment, back in that conference room months ago, when I'd looked at my brother and realized he wouldn't choose me. He'd choose silence. He'd choose comfort. He'd choose himself. But now I had chosen me. And that, in the end, was enough. Or at least, it had to be.